Hello, and welcome to episode 7 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutra. It is my utmost pleasure to introduce our very special guest for today's episode, Dr. Sandra Mitchell. Sandra is a professor and chair of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh and the current president of the Philosophy of Science Association. As a researcher, Sandra has always been fascinated by complexity. How does a complex organism or superorganism evolve or develop from simple beginnings? Why do intricate and sometimes unique structures occur in nature, like the nictitating lens of the chicken eye or the waggle dance of honeybees? Why do multi-drug therapies work better than single drugs for diseases like HIV and AIDS? Generally, Sandra's research focuses on epistemological and metaphysical issues in the philosophy of science. More specifically, her interests have centered on scientific explanations of complex behavior and how we might best represent multi-level, multi-component, dynamic, complex systems. She has published articles on functional explanation, units of selection and evolutionary biology, sociobiology, biological complexity and self-organization, scientific laws, robustness, and emergence. In conducting her research, Sandra has been informed by the sciences that study social insects, global climate, genetic regulation, psychiatric disorders, and protein structure. Currently, she is exploring cognitive resources for modeling scientific integrative practices, pragmatic metaphysics, and how to understand scientific data in both its production and its use. And Sandra and I actually both have a shared interest, I've come to learn, in social engagement in the philosophy of science. So just as I am doing this podcast with the hopes of reaching a broader audience for educating in the philosophy of science, Sandra has, working with colleagues, developed something called Instant HPS, which is a video series put out by faculty and graduate students in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh, in which they collaborate with an animator, musician, and a video company to produce accessible history and philosophy of science discussions of interesting problems and ideas. So if you want to check this out, you would go to Google and you type in Instant HPS, and there you can find some very interesting videos related to such questions as, is your brain a computer? Is race real? Featuring very own Sandra Mitchell, and an overview of Einstein's astonishing ideas. I think these videos are really, really something. They do a really nice job of addressing some really interesting questions, but also providing an insight as to how a scholar and researcher in history and philosophy of science will approach these kinds of questions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to Sandra Mitchell. Let's bring her in. Well, Sandra Mitchell, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and I'm doing great.
Great. How's the weather out there in Pittsburgh?
It's actually not very cold right now. It's been raining a little bit, but it's somewhere in the 40s, which we think in winter is a good thing.
That's great. That's okay. That's nice. And you are currently at the in the University of Pittsburgh, his Department for History and Philosophy of Science. Is that right?
That's correct.
That's great. That's great. And how's the spring semester getting along?
Well, we're in our third week, and I'm teaching a graduate seminar on the epistemology of experimental practices. And it's going great.
That's great.
It's really lively, and it's a new kind of one of my alternative format seminars. So it's more like a collaborative research group than a typical seminar.
That sounds really interesting. How did you come about teaching this course?
Well, I'm very interested in experimentation. So there's two answers, one about the topic and one about the format. So the format first is because I think graduate students need opportunities to acquire skills that you don't typically get in a standard seminar where you all read papers together and then near the end of the seminar the students come up with a topic and they have a couple of weeks to write a paper and then often you never want to see the paper again because you didn't really have much time to develop something deep and meaningful.
Yeah.
So sometimes a shock in the transition from doing that to writing a dissertation. So this is an opportunity for students. They have to have a project starting in the second week of the semester and then develop it over the semester and give project reports to the whole group where we help each other because the projects are related to the topic of the seminar. So we're all working in areas related to experimentation and epistemological issues, but we're all working on different experiments. We're dealing with different issues, and it makes for a very lively and interesting experience, I think, for everybody.
That's fascinating. How have you found the format working out in terms of allowing students to really focus on a project early on in the semester as opposed to, kind of the traditional format that you've suggested?
I think what it does is it teaches what I think of as an important skill, which I call strategic reading, which is when you're just reading in a new area, you're reading somebody's ideas that are written from their perspective, what they're trying to solve and their assumptions and their context. And what you need later in your research career, what you want to do is develop from your own perspective and your own interests an analysis, and then you want to read other papers for how they can contribute to what you're trying to do. So it's a shift in focus from what is the author trying to do to here's what I'm trying to do. How does this author help me in my own project? So I think I'm looking forward to that occurring. It's too early right now, but we have had some early reports, and everybody's very excited, and everybody has ideas to help each other on things that might contribute to the individual project. So far, so good.
Well, that's fantastic. And is it mostly students from your own department, or are there some other philosophy or science students that happen to take the seminar?
There's actually, this time around, there's a science student who is taking it, and the rest are from history and philosophy of science. In the past, I've had other science from biology departments and from philosophy department as well. But this time, that's the constellation.
Very nice, very nice. Well, I look forward to hearing about this particular course. Are alternative formats, is this something you teach regularly, or is this something kind of a new thing you're introducing?
This is probably the third time I've taught it over the last 10 years, I'd say. In part, you need both kinds of, you need multiple kinds of approaches, I think, to get different learning styles and different skills. So one needs to learn a corpus of work in order to understand where to situate your own views and where the problems are and what's the context in which the current debates are going on and so forth. So you need the standard seminar format as well as these more kind of research-driven collaborative groups. They're more like lab groups, kind of like a scientific model where people have lab meetings where they all have their own work and they come and they read something together and talk about it.
Yeah. And how have you found the collaborative process in terms of giving feedback on papers? How's that worked out in the past?
It's great. I mean, and not that I'm trying to get out of work, but I mean, sometimes I can leave the room. I mean, the other students are all, they're at multiple stages of their career, so they are their graduate career, so they have different backgrounds, but everybody shares papers. So if I discovered a paper on my project, if I'm a student, I'll say, "Oh, you should read this too, because I can see that it might help you in what you're trying to do." So the collaboration works, I think, extremely well.
No, this sounds phenomenal. No, I'll definitely keep this in mind in terms of future graduate courses. This sounds very interesting. Well, let's take a little bit of a step back. So, Sandra, before all of this happened, before getting into history and philosophy of science, where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Phoenix, Arizona, from the age of 5.
Oh, wow. Okay. Oh, a small world. I grew up in Tempe.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Parents from Chandler, father in Chandler, mother in Tempe. Yeah.
Great.
That's great. Yeah. So you grew up. Did you from age 5? You say?
Yeah, that's right.
Did you go to school out there?
I went to school through high school, and then I went to college in Southern California at Pittsburgh College in Claremont.
Okay. Before getting to college, yeah. How was growing up in Phoenix?
Well, I'm older than you are, I dare say. When
not too much.
When I was growing up, it was the fastest growing city in the United States, and so that meant when we first moved there, it was a pretty small town.
There wasn't a lot back.
With lots of desert, and it was interesting. It was a little, let's say, culturally deprived. I remember in grade school we went for a field trip. You know how you do that in grade school.
Yeah.
Great. And we went to a field trip because it was very exciting. An opera came to town.
Oh.
So we all went.
Wow. Big news of the opera coming to Phoenix.
It was a big news. And so that was kind of defines the character of the place. But it was, I think, a great place to grow up because you could be outside.
Yeah.
And you could ride horses and you could ride your bike and there was a lot of interesting Native American culture. Although not, when I was very young, it wasn't very much promoted. It was, in fact, not the political climate wasn't so great. But it was. I thought it was an interesting place to grow up.
Yeah, no, I can even recall earlier in the when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s that there was a lot of desert. There weren't a lot of the culture wasn't particularly thriving. Downtown Phoenix was not a place you wanted necessarily to go. If you worked there, that's fine. But there wasn't a whole lot. And now it's a pretty booming city, and just in terms of growth and expansion. And they're starting to get a little bit more culturally relevant, I think.
Yes, I think that's true.
Yeah. So during the times growing up in Phoenix, what were you, what did you find yourself interested in terms of, ideas for the future? What did you want to do, going through college, or what do you want to do when you grew up?
Well, that's interesting. I think there was a point where in school I really liked mathematics, so I thought I might become a mathematician. Although I also like to ride horses.
Okay.
So I might have joined the rodeo. So it was either the rodeo or mathematics. I couldn't quite figure that out.
Oh, that's fascinating. So did you spend a lot of time riding horses growing up?
I did. We didn't have a horse, but I would go to the stables and clean out the stalls in order to get to ride. And riding in the mountains and around Phoenix was pretty special. And so I really did enjoy that. I did a little bit of horse jumping, that kind of things. But that was before I was 12. That's early days.
Sure. Well, that's when you want to be a professional, equestrian rider, and those are the early childlike
I was
dreams.
thinking more of a rope and steers in the rodeo.
Oh wow!
But there you go.
Fun. Okay, all right. That's even better. That's more exciting.
But then what happened in high school and after is I got more interested in social issues and political issues, and it was during the Vietnam War and during the war on poverty and the civil rights movement. So the cultural climate was one that I think had a big impact on shaping what kind of life I wanted to live and what intellectual pursuits I wanted to engage in.
Yeah. Was there a particular, political or cultural event you can remember back then feeling particularly passionate about or motivated by?
Well, I think there were a couple. I know that when I was in high school, I was involved in helping to build a health clinic in the impoverished neighborhoods in around Phoenix, in Peoria, which you might even know where that is.
Yeah, northwest.
that was part of the war on poverty. There were funds for that, so there were some organizations to help do that. And I think civil rights and the Vietnam War, all of them were very important in the kinds of activities I was engaged with.
Very cool.
So there were also love-ins and things like that. It was a pretty exciting time.
What the love? So as opposed to sit-ins, or
there were sit-ins, and then there were like love-ins in Encanto Park. I'm making all these references since you might actually.
Encanto. I remember that. Yeah, that's just north of downtown. Yeah.
That's right.
Very nice.
So that was a time when I think it was an interesting time to kind of go through adolescence and young and adult, because really big issues. I'm just surprised not everybody became a philosopher then, because really big issues were sort of on the table every night. It was, how should we be in this war, and should we protest what the government's doing, and what kinds of social systems do we want to live in, and should we start communes and free schools, and so really all of the cultural institutions were coming up for examination, just in a way that they don't often do, I think. And those kinds of conversations, I think, are the what philosophy is about. It's about reflecting on some human practice or natural system and trying to figure out how to understand it and how to organize it. So I think that was a huge impact on getting me started in philosophy.
That's fascinating. So these things going on, you found your way into undergrad. Did you begin in mathematics, or how did you make your way to philosophy?
Well, pretty much the first year I did. I kind of already I took some philosophy classes, and I found them really hard, and that made me want to do them. Yes,
I know that experience. Do you remember maybe any of your first initial courses and being particularly challenged by them?
Well, the first philosophy course I took I took logic because I liked math, and then I took social imagination in the West, which was one of these from Plato to NATO courses, where you dealt with big ideas and you read historical papers, but you also read contemporary articles. And Pittsburgh College was a great place to go because there were small classes, and you really got philosophically engaged from the beginning in writing papers and conversation in class and discourse and things like that.
Yeah, so I see this
for
is
me it was very exciting.
So this is Pittsburgh. It's in Claremont, a liberal arts college.
Right.
Yeah. How do you like your time there?
It was great. It was a very politically oriented college. Everybody, in fact, some people like to say the professors were more radical than the students, but there were a lot of things going on, including protesting ROTC on campus. That was at the Claremont, what was called Claremont Men's College. It's now Claremont McKenna College, and there was my first year in college was when the Kent State massacre occurred, and students were killed by the National Guard in protest of the Vietnam War. So there was, again, going to college at that point, there was this heightened awareness of the world and how we should think about it and how we should live in it. And so it was a very interesting time. Pittsburgh as a college was great because it was you could do anything you wanted in some ways. You could design your own majors. You could start a free school. They had programs in Appalachia. You could go and do folk music and political organizing. So there were lots of opportunities. I really came into philosophy of science, though, when I spent my junior year at the London School of Economics. Oh, wow.
Did you do an exchange there?
Yeah, there was a program, and I got some funding, and I became what's called a special student, so a non-degree student. And before that, I really liked philosophy, but when I went to the LSE, this will date me now, but Lakatos was still alive, and it was a very exciting department because everybody was working on the cutting edge of the field, and it was easy to get caught up with how important and interesting this set of ideas was to develop. So I got hooked.
Absolutely. I
got hooked on philosophy of science.
Do you remember anybody you happened to work with there or get to take a class from?
Well, let's see. I did go back, so this is why it's going to be hard to remember my junior year. I went back to do a master's degree there.
Oh, okay. So, yeah. So there's a little bit. Yeah. Well, you must have loved it so much then.
I did. I thought this was... Well, one of the things was that the department then... So Popper was long gone. I never met Popper, but it was Lakatos's department in some ways. He was the professor, as was John Watkins, who was more of a Popperian. And then all the other professors were working on the Lakatosian program. So there was a sense you were part of an intellectual community, and everybody was pushing in the same direction, so to speak, doing different issues but all working towards developing this analysis of science. So that kind of, and so there was a lot of communality in the department, even for undergraduates and graduate students, where you would come in. I remember walking in, and Lakatos would say, "Well, what results did you get last week?" It's like, oh, you're taken seriously as a member of an intellectual community, and the hierarchy between student and faculty was blurred.
That sounds great. And even as a promising master's student, getting to work closely with those folks sounds that must have been really motivating. Were you?
Yeah.
So was that when you went back? So from undergraduate, did you go right into the master's?
I did. I went. What happened is I graduated, and then I spent the summer actually in London working for Lakatos, and I turned out that my job, because I needed to support myself, my job was to transcribe what turned out to be his last lectures, although we didn't know they were going to be his last lectures.
Sure.
Somebody had tape recorded them, and I sat with the tape recorder and typed them out, and so that was my summer job, and then I continued as a part-time student, again, being employed in different ways in London for 4 years to get the master's degree.
So what was your impression of Lakatos?
Well, when I was an undergrad, the one under my junior year, abroad year, I didn't have much to do with him. He was recovering from what he called his car accident, which consisted in him running into the open door of a car that was parked.
He
was in a neck brace and stuff. So he was a little scary for me as an undergraduate. But when I went back, having that experience of working for him in the summer, all of that kind of ebbed away. And it turned out that he was, as I said, always interested in what you thought. He'd say, "Well, what did you just read? What were you reading last week? Talk to me about it. What are your ideas about this?" And he would send his drafts of papers around to the other faculty, not so much the students at that point, but some of the students who were more senior, and get feedback from the students and the faculty on what he was writing. And so again, it was that sense of a community that he was very much part of. That I found that really very exciting and stimulating.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That sounds terrific. So while doing
which is maybe why I designed this kind of seminar where we're all helping each other. I never thought about that.
I'm very interested to see, because I can imagine having these informing experiences that I could totally see carrying over now, and it sounds like this alternative format definitely fits that kind of mode.
And I had never kind of made that connection, but that probably has something to do with it.
I bet. So you did. So with the master's at LSU, was that a 2 or 3 year program?
Well, at that time, they've changed it since. But that
Sure.
time, it was a 2-year full-time program.
Okay.
But I could only go part-time because I had a job to
sure.
make money.
Sure.
So I went part-time for 4 years. I initially was going to I went there to do the PhD. I was admitted to the PhD program.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turned out, Lakatos died halfway through my first year there.
Oh, geez.
And when that happened, there was, there wasn't anybody I wanted to work with. For me, the work changed, right? The environment changed in a way that I wasn't far enough along, to just continue on in my project. I was very much in my first year of graduate school, and so I completed the master's and then decided that it was time for me to return to the U.S.
Sure. So, where was the next stop on your college tour? You went from LSE, and where did you go next?
The University of Pittsburgh.
University of Pittsburgh. Fantastic. So that's what a wonderful place. So how do you get along in the department back as a graduate student?
Well, it was an interesting place. Times were different. One thing is, I always thought I had more to learn about everything. I guess I still think that.
Yeah.
So when I came to the HPS department, even though I had a master's from the LSE, I started over from scratch again.
Oh, okay.
So I did all of the work for a PhD.
Yeah.
Just as any incoming student would do, which I thought was fine, because there was new things to learn and new things to do. So again, it was an interesting time to be in graduate school.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I was the second woman to get a PhD in the program.
Wow.
So there wasn't an easy time to be a woman in philosophy of science or in philosophy because it's still not great, but it's better.
Yeah. I'd recently had Carol Cleland I had spoke with on the podcast, and she was very nice to chat with, but she had chatted about some difficult times in terms of dealing with being a woman in philosophy or a woman in the sciences as well.
Right.
Was that your experience as well a little bit as a graduate student?
Yeah, I think. Yeah. Well, I think that it's different when you're the only woman in the room. So I'd be in a workshop and being the only woman in the room would have been fine if people hadn't kind of noticed that.
Yeah.
But in those days, there was less, let's say, awareness about the consequences of forms of speech that demeaned women or just commented on things about women that were not relevant to your intellectual contribution to the workshop, for example. So those things were tough, and I think it was hard. There weren't any women on the faculty when I was starting out. Later on in my career, Imre Lakatos was hired to the faculty, and that made a big difference. It made a huge difference, just having women in that position. That as a graduate student, I could look around and say, "Oh, okay, so women can do this. You can have a life like this. There is a future." Right, doing this, and it also just changed the tone and the environment of the department. So,
and this was while you were studying there. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so as you're studying, So what was the goal of the department? I suppose is to train folks to carry on for research and teaching positions. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Okay, great. Do you recall who was around during that time?
Well, there's the philosophy department and the history and philosophy of science department at Pitt have a really close relationship. So there were a lot of philosophers of science also in philosophy. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of almost like a who's who of philosophy of science in the time, because in the philosophy department was Carl Hempel.
Oh, wow.
And Wilfrid Sellers and Adolf Grunbaum, and people who also worked around in those areas, like Nick Rescher and Jerry Massey. And in the philosophy department, when I first arrived, there was some people who are just now retiring, to be honest with you. Ted McGuire and Peter Mockamer and Ken Schaffner and Larry Loudon was there initially. He left after some time. And Jim Lennox and John Norton. In fact, these are still my colleagues mostly. And then Marilee Salmon joined the department.
Wow. Do you recall any?
But it was sort of great taking courses from Grunbaum and Hempel and Sellers. I mean, that was awesome. Right?
Yeah. Did you feel? I mean, at the time, was there the same kind of recognition that you would see today when as going on? Were they then considered leaders in the field?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I bet. Yeah. Wow, that's fun. Do you have any fun stories with those folks?
Huh.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
Stories. Well, one thing is that Peter Hempel had already retired. He had moved from Princeton to Pittsburgh, and he still taught while I was here I think he taught for another 10 years after I first started taking classes. But he was already a major figure in the field, and I remember writing papers for his seminar, and then he would handwrite notes, pages of notes about what you had done, and meet with you. And so he was he had none of the affectations of a prima donna. He was somebody who cared about the ideas and interacted with you about your ideas and took you seriously. And so he was just absolutely charming and smart and creative, and so he was just. It was surprising because we all said, "Oh, Carl Hempel,
sure.
I'm going to take a seminar from him," and then you get back these handwritten pages of notes on what you've written. So, I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, that's great. It's always surprising when you have someone that you can look up to so highly, such an esteemed scholar, yet they're still a person who's interested, or you come to find that out. It's really motivating. So what kinds of projects or interests were you thinking about during graduate school? Maybe your dissertation work or other ideas?
Well, I shifted around a little bit. I started out, I did my master's degree and my master's thesis in London on Isaac Newton's laws of motion. And got that was a fascinating project, but then decided I'd rather work in philosophy of social science, trying to unite more my interest in what was going on politically and socially with my intellectual work. And in that pursuit, I ended up doing graduate work at Pitt in anthropology as a social scientific angle, and then kind of fell in love with biology. And my dissertation was actually on functional explanation in cultural anthropology and evolutionary biology, trying to see why certain strategies, explanatory strategies that seem to be quite successful in biology, were adopted by anthropologists, like the language of function, but didn't seem to be as successful an explanatory strategy. So it was a kind of comparative work in that area. I had started working in philosophy of biology already when I was at the London School of Economics, but that was in its very early days as a field, and there wasn't anybody really doing that in Pittsburgh when I came, but that didn't matter. You just do it. You study with people on what their research is on, and you learn a lot. You don't have to learn exactly what you want to work in.
So what did you? So
that's how I ended up there.
Okay. So what did you find out in terms of while these types of explanations were adopted, they weren't being as successful. What did you think?
Well, the analysis, and this was also when sociobiology, which was kind of a hybrid of looking at the questions that cultural anthropologists and sociologists would ask, but using biology to answer them. So it was in that sort of intersection between those two major ways of approaching explanations of human behavior that I was exploring. And I think what the lesson of that dissertation, which it was quite a while ago now,
Sure.
but was that it was in defense of an etiological account of function, which has which requires a causal structure like evolution, like evolution by natural selection. So you need some form of selective selection causation occurring for functions to be explanatory. And so the question is, what would substitute for that? Given that we have natural selection in Darwinian selection in biology, and then other more complicated forms of selection like group selection, what played that role in anthropology? And it was harder to document that. So what was missing? It works when there were things that fulfilled that kind of formal requirement of having selected effects or selection causation operating. Then the language of function worked very much analogously to how it works in biology. But in cultural anthropology, it was often thought to be implicit or latent functions that weren't through human choice, which is a form of selection that would have worked. Some of it, for one of the examples I looked at, was scapulomancy in the Quakiutl Native American communities, where they used deer bone. When they were running out of good hunting grounds, they would take the bone of the shoulder bone of a deer and throw it in the fire, and then read off the cracks of it they brought it out of the fire as a map to find a new place to hunt.
Wow. And
it turned out that was kind of successful because that was basically a randomizing.
Oh.
It turns out that would give them a kind of random direction to go in.
Sure.
And in that particular context, you don't want to go back to where you've always gone back because you will have depleted the resources. So randomizing turned out to be
pretty
kind of successful.
Wow, that's fascinating. Okay, so that sounds like a very interesting dissertation.
I haven't thought about that for decades.
Well, I'm pretty impressed with your representation of it. That's I appreciate that. So after working in graduate school, I imagine what was your path there for? How did you end up finding a job in philosophy of science?
So I went from. This was the bad old days when you actually didn't have to finish your dissertation before you got a job. Sure. So I hadn't finished my dissertation, but I got a job at Ohio State University.
Oh, great!
And went there I was there for 4 years. During that time, I did finish my dissertation.
Well, that's good. Was this in their philosophy department?
This was in the philosophy department.
Okay.
But I ended up hooking up with a group of biologists at Ohio State, which is part of what, in fact, continued my move from this kind of intersection with social sciences to more focus on biology, is that I got connected with a bunch of biologists, and we ran a lecture series, and we taught classes together, and we had reading groups together. So it was a very exciting. Philosophy of biology was in a very exciting period of growth as an independent subfield, and the questions were really interesting to engage with. So I got more interested in the philosophy of biology as well as philosophy of science in general during my period at Ohio State.
Okay, and then how did you like it at Ohio?
Well, I liked a lot of things about it. One is that like I said, being in a community with scientists, and it was just great for me. And I even was very excited to get a publication in Animal Behavior during that period. And having a voice in both in philosophy and in the sciences has always been an important goal of mine. So that was where I began having, doing more engaged with scientists. And one of the scientists, it's interesting because just last month I was at a symposium in his honor, and that's Rob Page Jr., who's an entomologist who's now at Arizona State University. But he was one of the four of us who found each other and started talking, and I ended up doing a lot of collaboration with him on explanations of division of labor in social insect colonies. And in fact, our collaboration really got even further developed when we both had left. We both came in as assistant professors pretty much at the same time. And then he went off to Davis, and I went off to UC San Diego, and we continued our collaboration in California.
Yeah. So what was how did you find it to get to have to form such a what appears to be a tight-knit collaboration between you, philosopher of science, and Robert Page, the scientist, primarily?
Well, I try to give advice to graduate students and young scholars in this because it's some of it's just luck. Not everybody. It's hard to collaborate with people.
Sure.
You have to establish trust. You have to have mutual trust, and so that takes time. So collaboration isn't immediate. It's something you cultivate. And so for me, it just happened that we spent years reading together and teaching together and having conferences together before we tried to even write something together. Mm-hmm. And so by then we knew each other, how the other one thought about things. And for me, it was a very lucky collaboration because Rob was somebody who was full of ideas, and I was full of ideas, and somehow it clicked, it worked. And that, again, is in some sense about what people you actually end up working with. I've collaborated with other scientists, so and they've all been kind of different experiences, but with Rob Page, it was a really exciting, pushing the boundaries kind of research that we were doing, and so it was very exciting times.
Very nice, very nice. And yeah, I see. Is he still at Arizona State? It looks like.
Yes, he is.
Oh, very nice. Okay.
So that was it. In fact, I was in. I don't even remember how many years. At least 10 years. I was part of what was called a working group on social insects that met at the Santa Fe Institute that he ran, and I was the only philosopher in the group, but I know a lot of people in the community. I gave papers at the entomological society meetings and the International Social Insect Society meetings. So being part of that group was really a huge benefit for my insight into the practices of science. It gave me access in a way that I think has shaped my ideas.
Yeah, so I know from having taken a few dynamical systems courses, one of the prime examples of studying complex behavior is in the study of like social insects, ants, bees, etc. And I've noticed that you have done quite a bit of research on representing and understanding complex behavior in biology. Do you feel like this kind of research informed that, or sort of led you toward taking that on as a field of interest?
I think, when you look back, you see what you've been doing, which you might not have known while you were doing it.
Sure.
So looking back, I think actually trying to understand how scientists explain complex behavior has been the central theme of all the different aspects of science and philosophy that I've looked at. From the social insects was one place that really reinforced it, although I still think human social behavior is more complex. Yep. So that's also an area that, was something that was motivating for me even before that. And then I ended up doing some work on psychiatric genetics, which is another domain. And for the last 5 years or so, I have a collaboration with a structural biologist on predictions of protein structure. And so there, but the same kinds of issues about complexity and emergence and multiple causes and multiple levels and robustness and things like that arise in all of these different domains, although they have new things to teach us by looking at them in these different scientific locations.
Yeah, so one of my interests currently is in psychiatric disorders and in the philosophy of psychiatry. Yeah. So it happens to be, and I've been doing some work on this new research domain criteria that the National Institute of Mental Health is coming out with. So I saw that you had written a paper. I think it was a chapter in philosophical issues in psychiatry. This was probably a while ago.
Right, that's correct.
Yeah, so you mentioned what was some of your, if you can recall, some of your interests in psychiatric genetics and what it says for psychiatric disorders?
There's a lot of things to say. What I was looking at there in part was the characterizing the kinds of complexity that were involved especially in genetic approaches to psychiatric disorders. Since, as you know, medicine has embraced a kind of genetic reductionism for a long time. And, it would be great if the world was like that because it would make things a lot easier.
It'd be so great.
But it isn't. So we have to figure out how to live in the complicated world we live in and how to know things about it and how to figure out how to use what you know. And in part, the work on psychiatric genetics kind of emerged, everything's connected, from the work I'd done on social insect genetics.
Okay.
And I was going to Gordon conferences. I don't know if you know what those are. They're scientific conferences on behavioral genetics.
Okay.
So once you're looking at behavioral genetics, that spans everything from why do these bees forage for pollen and not nectar to why is this person suffering from a major depressive disorder. So that kind of way of classifying phenomena lets you see what the different roles and that genes play and how they're modified by experience actually turns out both in insects and humans. Gene expression in the brain is moderated by social environment. And that's pretty interesting.
That is interesting. Yeah, I think recalling just like is the folks' interpersonal relationships or those who are experiencing particular psychiatric disorders, for example, but then have modifications, genetic modifications or different expressions.
The expressions of the genes. So you have your genes, right?
Yeah.
There's mutations that sometimes occur, but what's really important is when are those genes turned on, so to speak, and therefore generating proteins that perform or fail to perform functions for your maintaining your self and your mental state, et cetera, like that. And that this whole idea of gene and environment interaction is really important because, again, that's kind of the heart of the nature versus nurture debates that have been going on for probably a century or more.
Yeah, sure.
And the answer is it's both. And so there was some work on. Became interested in that the way those interactions generated behaviors or properties in complex systems. So there was this research. Now it's come under scrutiny. I think the vote is not yet in on the way in which both particular genetic gene variation and childhood trauma kind of collaborate to amplify the probability of having depressive disorder. So if you just have childhood trauma, some people will end up as an adult with depression, but some won't. And if you just have the short allele of a particular gene, HTTP gene, then you have some chance that you might end up with major depressive disorder, but neither of them were very strongly predictive by themselves. But if you have them both, it turns out it was much more highly predictive that you would have this psychiatric disorder as an adult.
Oh, that's fascinating.
So that's an interesting thing to figure out.
So, yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah. I mean, so is that sort of what people are thinking about, at least, currently? You said the verdict isn't out, but the general idea is that both nature and nurture matters. It's sort of in the boring middle, as people say, that like there's a lot of, it's complicated.
Right.
So is there, I have the sense that sometimes there is, certainly people take stands like more toward one way or the other, like more toward a reductionist stance or more toward, I don't know. Do you have a sense of how things are currently in the field?
I don't think I have a good sense of, in terms of psychiatric genetics or in terms of psychiatry in general. I don't think I have a good measure of what the field is going on in the field. I do know that there was attempts to introduce genetics into the DSM-5 because DSM-4 didn't have any genetic content to the diagnostics. So I know there's a move towards including more, because we now have access to the genetic information we didn't have before. The trouble is that it just doesn't, as with almost all psychiatric disorders, it's multifactorial. There are multiple factors. And so knowing just one isn't going to really give you that kind. It's not like it's not like a litmus test, literally, where you can do a test and then the paper turns blue and they have this, and if it doesn't, they don't. You can't do that in these kinds of disorders. And so I know genetics is really important. It's a new resource. But there's really interesting philosophical complications other than the scientific ones about what kind of information genetics gives you for a clinical setting. I mean, you can do research on it, right? And then genes, you can give an account of how genetic variation might contribute to some difference in disease phenotype or endophenotype. But the question is, how do you use that in the clinic? I mean, if you're a psychiatrist treating people, how can you use that information? It doesn't seem to be very accessible or useful in that domain. So there's really interesting philosophical questions about what genetic information signifies, right? In those two practices, research psychiatry, excuse me, and clinical psychiatry.
Absolutely.
So those are things that are interesting. Classifications, problems are all over psychiatric disorder,
Absolutely. So was this the kind of work, was this something you were involved in while you were at UCSD, or was this a little bit later?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I think I started the work. Did I start there? I was doing the behavioral genetics at UCSD. I think I only started the psychiatry part of the story once I got to Pitt, in part inspired by Ken Schaffner, who was working in that, very deeply in that area.
Yeah.
But I do remember I met Ken Kendler, who is a psychiatric geneticist, at one of the Gordon conferences on behavioral genetics when I was interested in social insects. So I'm not quite sure. These all intersected somewhere in between being at San Diego. I was at UC San Diego for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Before I returned. We call it returning to Pittsburgh, but it was a long time.
Yeah, that's a long
I was here.
time away. Yeah. How did you like San Diego?
San Diego is an interesting place. I think in terms of the work I was doing, I don't know. Maybe I let the environment influence me too. I think we all do, right?
Sure, sure.
One project I started while I was there had to do with biodiversity, because San Diego County has the greatest amount of biodiversity in the U.S. except for Hawaii, and of course San Objego was a place that was coming under a great deal of development pressure. So they wanted to kind of pilot a new approach to the issues about preserving species and the environment and all of that, which was called habitat protection rather than protecting species. And it turned out, at least from my assessment and others, to be pretty much a disaster. But
why was that?
I mean, habitat is better to protect habitat than go after species who are triaged in their last moments before they go extinct, right?
Sure.
Putting all your money into that seems to be a kind of dumb one. If you could preserve a whole habitat, you would preserve a lot of species from getting to the stage where they were endangered or threatened. And so I forgot what your question was.
Oh, I was just, I was asking how San Diego, and then I was just, in terms of, you had mentioned this habitat project was a disaster?
Well, it's still in place. It's just that it was it got me interested in two things. One, again, is here we have enormous issues about complexity and how biodiversity is a diminishing, and when we can't even count it in the first place, and what are the factors that contribute to it, to move some of my interest into the policy domain. What kinds of policies, that's what I was going to tell you, what kinds of policies can we develop that respect the kinds of complexity of the systems that the science is studying? And of course, many policymakers and government policymakers want a simple and eternal answer to questions like, what should I want a policy? I don't want to have to vote on a policy every year. I want a policy now that maximizes utility for the long run. And the trouble is, when you're studying complex dynamic systems, the kinds of knowledge you get usually aren't that secure, right?
Yeah.
And general. Sometimes they're context specific, and sometimes they're temporally specific. And so developing policies is trying to squeeze the science of complex nature into a cost-benefit analysis turns out to be rather difficult, right? And this is also when you would get scientists who would argue it's similar to what's going on with global climate change, because scientists will, so to speak, disagree about particular numbers. What's the rate of decline in biodiversity? How likely are we to raise the sea level by 10 degrees in 100 years? These are things that you're going to have different views from the scientists, because those kinds of predictions are driven in complex systems are really you're unable to get that kind of certainty, or even often a quantitative probability, right? For some that everybody agrees on. There is consensus that there's global climate change. There's more consensus now about the rate of rising temperatures, but there's still disagreements that are warranted by the complexity of the system. So what you would get for policymakers would kind of exploit this and say, if you brought a scientist in who said, "Oh yes, the California gnatcatcher is threatened," and another one says, "No, it's not," right? Based on my study, it's not. And based on my study, it is. Then without that kind of consensus, policymakers could exploit the lack of consensus in science, which in order to refuse to make a real policy that was respectful of the dynamics of the
which is based on this assumption that only active policymaking requires some sort of consensus at a particular level. And I mean, I think know, in general that's a good idea. It seems like people, agreement is good. But when you're dealing with something that struggles with agreement, when struggles with consensus, that you have to probably go about different ways in terms of what are your your standards for addressing policy.
I think it was also that the policymakers thought there was like one size fits all, that if I don't have certainty, I should at least have some kind of risk analysis where I can assign a probability, right? But sometimes you can't even do that, and so my own arguments have been directed at what kinds of policy vehicles can we develop, as well as what kinds of representational tools for representing what we do know, as opposed to think that if you don't meet this standard, right, certainty or quantitative probability, you don't know anything, which is just not correct.
Yeah. So what do you think in terms of? I really am fascinated by this idea of presenting some kind of a policy vehicle with which policymakers could adopt or at least think about. What do you think would be a reasonable approach?
Well, there are already in existence some, sure. and they make sense. And so there's a couple of different pieces of the story. And this appeared in my 2009 book, if you actually want to go read it, on Simple Truths.
On Simple Truth, yeah.
So the last section of that was how do we act on what we can know about complex structures. So one thing that has been used by the Forest Service for a long time is something called adaptive management, which is a strategy where you don't create a policy that sets aside this amount of this land here for preserving biodiversity. So one of the things that the habitat preservation policies in San Diego County did was they had a clause. This is what motivated me. I
sure.
think. They had a clause in their policy called the No Surprises Clause. And the No Surprises Clause meant that if you set aside this land for a golf course and this land for the birds to nest on, right, and in a way of trying to manage both demands, then if science learned something about the birds, like they would never nest where you set them the land to nest on, it was too late. Right? Nothing you learned could inform the policy once it was set, right? Oh. And this seemed really out of sync with the kinds of knowledge you have of ecology. So adaptive management is a strategy where you do you ever watch the TV show House? I
unfortunately have not. Could you remind me of this? Oh. Is this the doctor?
It's about the doctor who had these cases where the person was going to die and they didn't have time to run all the tests to find out what was causing them to die. Mm-hmm. So occasionally what he would do is he'd say, well, let's treat this. This could be it. Let's treat it, and if it works, then we'll know that was the cause.
Okay.
So adaptive management is kind of like that. Sometimes it's called learning by doing. Okay. So if you don't know what's causing the decline in some species that you would like to preserve, you could spend a long time trying to get that knowledge, right? Mm-hmm. In the meantime, the patient dies, right?
Yeah.
So if you don't, species goes
sure.
extinct. So instead, what you can do is say, okay, well, we have some indication that it could be this. Okay, it could be that this, introduced snake is killing the species off, and so let's treat it as though that was what it was the case, and monitor it and see whether or not it improves. Right.
Hmm.
So, and then as you learn, you restructure your policy in
sure.
light of what you learned. So it's a much more dynamic and ongoing way of engaging in policy, where it's not like, okay, well, this is what we know right now. Let's make our policy based on this, right? Instead, it's let's try things and learn from those attempts. Mm-hmm. What policy will best be effective.
Yeah, that sounds great. This kind of reminds me of some sort of like Bayesian decision making, but I could be totally wrong in terms of, at least investigating things and then adjusting our probabilities or credibility to a particular idea.
Yeah, it has that kind of updating feature mm-hmm. to it. But instead of being in a purely epistemic domain, it's in a domain where you're actually acting on uncertain knowledge in order to get less uncertain. I don't think you're uncertain.
So you're never, you're never like, you don't always assume that eventually it's going to collapse to this. This is the thing. I mean, it could be, but you're just trying to get more and more less.
Well, but see, one of the interesting things is when you're dealing with biodiversity or nature-nurture interactions is that the thing, it changes as you're engaging with it.
Oh.
Okay, so there isn't a once and for all answer. And as you're doing what you're doing, right, then the system itself, you need to keep reevaluating it because it's dynamically responding to what you're doing as well as to what the things that aren't what you're doing, how they're affecting the system too.
Oh boy, that is
I love complexity.
Oh, it's fascinating. Yeah, it's so difficult. Well, like you said, if you enjoy taking philosophy courses because they're challenging, I mean, then this is probably one of the most challenging questions in terms of science and philosophy. So you're back at Pitt's. You've been there since 2000. Is that right?
Correct. That's right.
Great. So how have things been going in terms of the department, your research? What's been going on?
Oh, so many things. So I'm chair of the department. I've been chair for a long time. And I think the department is great. I mean, I have to say I'm a big cheerleader for Pitt HPS. We get terrific students.
Yes.
It's a real collaborative environment. People are doing cutting edge work, and we're so lucky. I feel so lucky to be here because it's not just that we have a department with lots of people who are working in history and philosophy of science. I mean, a huge critical mass. But there's still philosophers of science in the philosophy department at Pitt, and there's a lot of philosophers of science at the philosophy department at Carnegie Mellon. And we also have the Center for Philosophy of Science, which brings in 6 to 8 new philosophers of science every year to hang around. So in some sense, it's sort of, philosophy of science nirvana, right? To have all of these people doing interesting work, it's extremely stimulating. And for me, it's been just a real gift to be in an environment that pushes everybody to do interesting and creative work. So I think Pitt's terrific, and so I've loved being here. I've loved being back in.
That's
Pittsburgh.
Fantastic. How does it compare to the your experience? I recall in the masters at LSE, where you felt like there was a really nice community. I imagine it's not everything's not around the Lakatosian program, but what's it like?
I think that's interesting. I think it's bigger than LSE was when I was there, the department and the environment. And I think you're right. It's not that we're all things. It also marks a change in the field over time. So when Lakatos was working, there was this a kind of move, which was in fact when the department here of History and Philosophy of Science was founded, was when there was this interest that somehow his philosophy of science and history of science had to be done together to really understand scientific change or scientific rationality. And those were the big questions on the table at those times. What's rational? Is it rational to choose this theory or that theory, right? Or or Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, was hugely important in this time, about who argued at some level it was irrational. Scientific change was irrational. And so those were the big questions, and everybody who joined in was working in some sense in that set of questions, the big questions of philosophy of science, right? What's explanation? What's confirmation? What's rational theory change? And those sets of questions have been replaced. Not entirely; they're still there, still around. There's still important things to do, but they've been replaced to a more diversified set of issues that are tied more closely to particular scientific practices. So now philosophy of physics and philosophy of chemistry and philosophy of social science and philosophy of economics and philosophy of biology. These all have created more more local questions about particular conceptual, metaphysical, and epistemic problems within biology, right, or within physics, and they may not be the same questions. Some questions, travel across multiple scientific domains, but there's been this, I think, a more particular and context-rich approach to some of the philosophical issues that have occurred. So I think that kind of shows up in the HPS department of 2017 at Pitt, where we have people working in philosophy of neuroscience, right, and philosophy of cognitive psychology and philosophy of physics and philosophy of biology. And now I don't know what to call what I do because it's kind of somewhere between physics, chemistry, and biology to talk about protein structure. So what we get is that we're all interested, but not work. But we're interested with particular different sciences. So we still are collaborative and interested in talking with each other and write together and teach together. But it's not that we're all working on the same program anymore.
Yeah,
so I think that's a difference.
So while it's how do you find then the I guess sort of the benefits or the consequences as well of this kind of particular context dependent approach to doing HPS work as opposed to doing it in the past?
Well, I think it's just, the other thing is there's a lot more philosophy of science being done now. So I think that's great.
Yes.
I think that's fantastic. Everything from people now looking at policy issues, looking at science and values and science and context, as well as looking at the particular, again, questions that arise from the practices within a particular science. So I think I'm a pluralist everywhere. So I think we learn more by learning different things. We learn more by learning more about one thing, but we also learn by comparing, contrasting, and seeing what piece of the story one approach is getting, and how that relates to another piece of the story that a different approach is getting. So I think that this move within philosophy of science has been really great. Now, one of the missions of HPS at Pitt, which is one that I embrace, is that the history and philosophy of science you do needs to be very well informed by the actual science, and so that's an emphasis that's part of our mission. And so for me to have a voice in scientific communities as well as philosophical communities is the payoff from being able to have that kind of close knowledge of a science.
Yeah, absolutely. So am I correct to say, are you the new president-elect of the Philosophy of Science Association?
Almost correct. I am, as of January 1st, the new president of the Philosophy of Science.
Oh, wow. Well, congratulations. Is this your first?
Well, thank you.
That's very nice. Is this your first time serving as the president of the PSA?
Yeah, I think you only get to do it once.
Okay. They have stopgaps to make sure your power doesn't overrun.
Well, let me put it this way: it's a 6-year commitment.
Okay.
How many times are you going to do that, right?
Not very often. No. Well, that's great. So, perhaps you could, in the last few minutes, I know we're probably running a little short on time here. Okay. What do you have in store for the PSA?
Well, it's great to follow it on and follow the presidents who have been active in PSA in the immediate prior time, because there's been a real shift in Philosophy of Science Association to become more independent and more kind of independent professional organization. So we're having so that has challenges, but it's really great to determine our own fate. We've been very tied with History of Science Society for many years, and that has been very successful strategy for us. But now we're bigger. We're bigger, and we're ready to kind of take on more responsibilities for our own society. And I think that's going to lead to a really more inclusive and more open environment for the society. So that's one of the things. We're becoming more and more independent. We may be meeting with other societies or meeting on our own instead of always with the History of Science Society. The other thing is there's been a lot of emphasis on increasing diversity in the organization, and also having. I've been very keen on promoting social engagement for philosophers of science, and I think you can't ignore the contemporary climate, not just in the U.S., but you see it all across the world these days of legitimizing the denial of the role that science should play in our crafting our societies and our actions. So there's the science the climate deniers, the anti-vaxxers, all the things in which facts and data should be playing a role in our making good decisions. There's increasing legitimacy for denying a role for science, and I think philosophers of science have a responsibility in that climate to have a public voice, since that's what we do. We talk about what's good, what makes a good justification for a claim, what kinds of evidence are relevant to deciding which hypothesis to adopt and which policy to direct from that our scientific understanding. So I think that I'd like to see that social engagement get even a higher profile in the society.
I absolutely love that idea. How and I see you have on your page here, you even have a whole tab on social engagement, which I think is fantastic. How could you think philosophers of science like yourself and others who might be listening to this become more socially engaged, or how could the PSA be more socially engaged?
Well, I think there's lots of different ways. So there's a sense in which we're all engaged with the general public through our teaching, right? So we all are a little bit socially engaged, and we learn how to speak to non experts in our field in that way. But a lot of people have participated in, say, National Academy panels that review pesticides, or write op-ed letters, articles, or write letters to the editor in the newspaper, or give more public presentations and talks to the public, not to our community. And those are some of the ways in which I think we need to be part of the public discourse on science and evidence, and there's lots of different ways. There's some people who've done work through museums, through science museums, to introduce these philosophical contributions. I'm very involved in the American Association for the Advancement of Science, for example, which has a very public goal. And so I think I would like to see us work both in engaging more with the public. This is actually sort of interesting, that the original mission of the Philosophy of Science Association, when it was founded in the 30s, was to engage philosophy with science, with philosophy that wasn't philosophy of science, with general philosophy, and with the public. And I think we want those three. That mission was shrunk to just promoting research in philosophy of science after World War II, and I think it's time to embrace all three planks of that mission. That for philosophers of science to be engaging with philosophers who aren't philosophers of science. I think we're working on similar issues from different approaches that are mutually informative. I think with scientists, again, that's part of the mission of HPS, and part of my own goals have been to engage directly with science and have some contribution to those domains, and also to engage with the public either through policy or through just public discourse. So I think all of those things I'd like to see the Philosophy of Science Association promote and provide resources to help our membership, right? Learn how to do those things. Some of us do it, some people do it. We need to share those practices and create environments where people can learn new skills.
Absolutely.
It's not this. Giving a talk to the general public's different than giving a talk to your colleagues, it turns out.
Yeah, it most certainly is.
Kind of harder.
Yeah, it can. Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely communication. You just have to learn how to, there's definitely changing up the talk is definitely a skill that can be learned. Well, that's I'm really excited to hear about the new potential missions of the PSA and these issues with social engagement. Is there a possibility? You think it'll still be offered every 2 years, or will it? I was always curious about that. Why the decision to have it a biennial conference?
I don't know when that decision was made. I think it was about between 40 and 50 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And it was the case that the Philosophy of Science Association used to meet with the AAAS, actually, with scientists. And then, so I don't know the precise history of when we switched to meeting with HSS. So it is possible we might think of doing an interim inter-year conference, or to meet every year. Those are beginning conversations. We're not a very rich organization at this point.
Sure.
So the question is, do we have enough resources to actually launch that, and what would be the impact on attendance and all sorts of things?
Sure.
That level of conversation. It's also the case that many other societies and the PSA now kind of interweave.
Alternate,
we meet this year and alternate, and the ESA, the European Society, meets the alternate year. BSPS, British Society, meets every year. So it's a question of finding timing where it's an advantage to philosophers of science to have more meetings like that.
Sure.
Rather than something that you then, there's too many meetings and you have to choose. There's been the introduction of a lot more specialized meetings too. So that I don't know what meetings do you go to?
Well, you're right. There's so the Cognitive Science Society is an annual meeting they do every year.
Right.
I don't go to that every year. But it's kind of similar to the PSA, where you can submit posters, but mostly you would submit a shortened version of a paper that, if selected,
right,
you would be published in the proceedings. But I think, I think there is, to be honest, I don't think it would be too bad if that was every 2 years. I think I think colleagues tend to like the smaller, more specialized meetings as well, or like the opportunity to go to both, to go to the big, sort of headlining conferences like the PSA and the Cognitive Science Society. Society for Philosophy and Psychology is also a really good one. That happens every year.
Right.
Southern Society for Philosophy and Psychology. I have not gone to that, but I've heard it's really good.
So really, how many can you go to in a year?
I don't know. So. How many can you go to in a year? I don't know.
Yeah, I guess it takes time, it costs money. So there's something nice about it being, for me, for every 2 years, because then people really come, because if you miss one, it's like 4 years. You go to
it's like the Olympics or something.
In between.
Like, you
and
can't
so
miss
I think it really induces people to show up, and it really marks a spot of, here's what's going on in the field, every 2 years. So
I think that's good.
I'm not sure where we'll end up on that conversation, but there's not going to be a change in the immediate future.
Sure. I'm not necessarily advocating for the immediate change or whatnot. I was just curious. I think I had a conversation with someone. Well, just, and also knowing that HSS tends to meet every year. So I'm wondering what
they do meet every year. Yeah.
But it's a little bit different kind of a conference. And so, I was just curious about that.
Well, it's an open question, so ideas are welcome.
Good, great. Well, we've chatted about quite a bit. We're getting probably toward the end. I probably kept you a little bit longer than I had mentioned. Sandra, is there anything you'd like to offer or add about any new research you're doing or new programs or activities you'd like to discuss?
Oh gosh. Well, we could go on a long time if you get me on what I'm working on now. So I'll just say a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I would love to hear. Yeah.
Working on, like I said, I've been developing through this collaboration, a deeper understanding of the ways in which scientific representation, so the human side of the story of complexity science, how different forms of representation are and perspectives on complex systems, in this case on protein structure prediction, how they work together to produce better knowledge than any of them on their own, in a way that doesn't eliminate any of them or unify them into one approach. So again, for me, it's always been the story of integrative pluralism. How do we need a lot of different accounts, but not all accounts are legitimate. So which ones are? And once we have a lot of accounts, how do they fit together? And so it's very exciting to think about the way that story plays out in the case of protein structure.
Yeah, so in terms of protein structure, tell me a little bit, or for those who aren't particularly immersed in this kind of research.
Well, all right, 2 sentences. Let me see if I can do it in 2 sentences, a real challenge. Proteins are the molecules that DNA codes for. And then, so once you have genes, your genes produce proteins, and your proteins do all the work from, signaling light from the eye to the V1 in the brain to bringing oxygen from the lungs to the heart. Everything in your body is done by proteins. Okay, so they're the functional units in all things organic. And so the question is, the issue is that their structure, they start off life, so to speak, when they're being generated from DNA in a linear sequence. And from that sequence, they have to fold up into some complicated structure in order to perform the functions they perform. And so there's a question about what those structures are, and how do they acquire them, how do they maintain them. There's a practical side, because there's a lot of protein misfolding diseases like Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, and how do we go? There's a practical end to knowing what the structures, the functional structures are, and how we can restore them, right?
Sure.
Or recover them, or produce them in the advent of a mutation. And so there's a lot of interest, both medically and scientifically, about how do we know how can we predict what the structure of a protein is, so that we can use that knowledge to do good work. And it turns out it's pretty, it's hard. The question again was a reductive one. Can we do it just through the physics of the atoms in the molecule? Do we have to do it through experimental engagement? There's now a new game called Fold It that you can play online.
Oh, I think I've heard of this.
That has it's actually had some results where it discovered novel protein structures. And so there's all these, these ways of trying to come to grips with something that looks like it should be like fairly simple, turns out to be very complicated, because there's multiple ways in which you can model it and characterize it and engage with proteins to get an understanding of their structure.
Well, this sounds very fascinating. So is there any, what kinds of particular results you're gleaning from these investigations, or any particular claims you're ready to make?
Well, I have a recent paper with my collaborator that was published online in BJPS in 2015, and that one looks at why you need all the multiple perspectives, what work they do, and also some interesting ways in which they work together. I'm now working on a book project that may take a little longer, to come out that really takes on this challenge of, it's not just about proteins, although they're part of the story, about how multiple perspectives, how do we use multiple perspectives in a way that actually increases our knowledge, not just gives us more knowledge, but gives us more accurate knowledge. And so that's kind of where I'm working these days.
That's fantastic. So it's I imagine the multiple perspectives specifically in I suppose molecular biology, or is there other is that just one example case? Well,
it's kind of a general claim, and so, like I said, some of the examples will come out of protein science, but the work I did in the social insect group is the same story, or evolutionary and developmental biologies, and is the same story in genetics and epigenetics. These are all different ways, both different causal factors, but also different ways of conceptualizing behavior that contribute, I think, important insights.
Well, this is great. It's great to hear. Well, Sandra, it's been a real pleasure getting to chat with you and learn a little bit about your story, and see see you make some of those early connections as well in terms of what has motivated and informed your work. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. And best of luck on this new format course. It sounds like a great opportunity, and I do hope it goes well this semester.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Take care.